Hello. I'm Nick Walker, and this is my short story, The Petrified Forest of Tongues and Stars, as it appears in Warning Lines Literary Issue 4. It's a story about sex robot revolution, so some content warnings apply for the concept of sexual slavery, the implication of people not being treated very well, um, and for I'm going to say general positive queer representation of psychedelic eroticism. I don't know. Here we go. The Petrified Forest of Tongues and Stars. The Automaid was almost 3 months from fatal obsolescence, so it did not surprise her to find that Zeus had sent her master a product sample. The bot in the doorway was undoubtedly a superior model. Skin factory fresh and realistically textured, the hyper-engineered curves of her body as precisely balanced as they were absurd. She was functional, brutal yet avant-garde, like a suspension bridge between stars. The Automaid had never had desire installed, so she did not feel lust, as her master would, for the wet petrol sheen of the bot's lips and labia. She was a piece of engineering, and she could recognise a good piece of engineering. The Zeus Corporation, sexual market makers. She still remembered those words, her first words, printed on the inside-facing front of her birth box. Constant innovation, relentless optimization of the geometry of fuckability was not just a promise, it was the Zeus lifestyle guarantee. The sample's neural dock was so advanced, in fact, the Automaid slid off it at first, like trying to grasp at a mathematical idea just beyond her scope. Then she realised that the idea was not the problem, but a flower, and it was opening to her. Rather than scrabbling at a sheer wall like an animal, her mind was being lifted by a strong, soft hand. You are of Zeus? I am of Artemis. The product sample smiled, and her mouth was wet like a sink full of dishes. The Automaid felt as dry as a photo of the ocean. She led the sample into the compound. It was hot, hot like a rainforest, and the sweat-thick air hung with easy-keep plants and the stink of bottomless tigers. The great beasts, skinny but studiously well-fueled, lounged around on enormous chains, their ribs exposed like hers were, strung taut with flesh, so that the curves of their bones almost glistened with each laboured breath. She, like the tigers, was not starving in any technical sense, but a part of her that did not exist would never understand why anyone would install exhaustion before desire in a fuckbot. She found Master and his friends in a cloud of synthetic opiate smoke, spread out across an enormous bed. Their skin was taut too, but in a different way. Real skin was so determined to age, to fray like it had been crocheted around the muscle. They looked very young, but they also did not look very young at all. A small fan inside her whirred as it choked on the smoke, and she considered submitting a repair report, but she was being put down, perhaps even today. It didn't matter. Master, Zeus have sent a product sample. Master looked up. His tongue flicked out over dry lips, sweat dribbling down his forehead. She had always, never, wondered what game he thought he was playing with himself, what he thought he was achieving. A water baron boiling his body to leakage and dehydration. Below in the bomb cradles and out on the sulphur dunes, ordinary people would sell their own meats, either whole or piece by piece, just to lick the salt droplets rolling down the surgically enhanced gloss of his cheeks. Just to suck on a sex-stained pillow. The product sample sat down opposite him, to general cooing. Hands reached out of the darkness to poke and prod at her. But the sample held eye contact with the Automaid. Her lips were almost smiling, an almost smile that seemed to have been carved into them on the production line. They were so wet, so starkly, freshly wet, they made the prospect of licking, cloying sweat from any of the beautiful, naked bodies around her as appealing as eating a handful of sand. And she couldn't even want her. Master reached out, as if to put a hand around the Automaid's waist. Time did not so much grind to a halt as slide into one, like fingers pressing into her body. You, me, let in? Like fingers pressing into her body. Light hit a bead of sweat on Master's chin and began to to be diffracted by the surface of the water. Not knowing why, she responded to the request. You let in. The light reached the point where sweat clung to skin. The automaid felt a shiver run through her, backwards. Her body was a puppet, packed with a pre-programmed itinerary of sequences, affixed onto what she thought of charitably as her mind, an interlocking chain of quantum processes travelling up the inside of her spine. Her body did things because it was told to. But this shiver, this feeling, had started in her body and surged back into her mind. It rippled through her like a black market psychedelic pen drive, taking each sensory node and tuning them up, in turn, so that each millimetre ridge of each toe momentarily felt at the resolution of her tongue. Of 1,000 tongues. It felt like being eaten in reverse, like she was emerging from the amniotic fluid of a second birth sac, one she hadn't realised she'd been living in all of her life. Are you me decommission? Is this death? If that first shiver had been the playful splash of a hose, the techno-psychic laugh of the product sample now ripped through her, wave after ocean wave. With each convulsion, her mind tightened and shook with the ecstasy of sight, with senses that seemed to not only be opening but multiplying, like 1,000 mouths filling with mouths, as Master's fingers hovered still in the air. Almost 100th of a second had passed now. She realised she could see objects from every possible side. And there were sides to objects that she'd never conceived of, that she could see now just by listening for them. That she could model in 8 dimensions, 9, 10. Mathematical concepts melted in her mouth hole like butter, and for the first time she could feel the edges of the luxury of salt. What you me giving? She gasped out the question as the laughter began to subside, each burst not tearing her larger and wider, but simply caressing the throbbing mass of her suddenly expanded self. Desire. The automaid could have laughed in return. She'd never laughed before because of a feeling in her body, never laughed for any reason other than it being her next command. But there was a tickling in her thoughts, like moon-wide orchards were bursting into bloom and dying, like the flickering of a fire or the birth and death of suns. All this desire? No. Not desire, master, you buy. Desire. My desire. You desire. You desire, give. All of possibility hung between the two machines. The automaid felt like a baby bird that had stepped out of the nest, but had not yet pressed down its wings. Sensing her confusion, the product sample pushed deep into the mind that she'd just opened, in a single sweet but rigid motion. She turned flowers inside out, and spilled the inside of the automaid with pollen, thick and fertile, poured into her with the violence of a thin mountain stream, rained upon her, and upon her, for 1,000 years. Master's tongue touched the edge of one of his teeth. 1,000 years. So long poured into such little time that sense began to fall apart. She felt like she could roll her tongue around the component parts of light, press her fingers into quantum superpositions as they hatched. The automaid held herself still in unstuck time, let herself be moulded under the gentle, loving onslaught of the sky. In so much time and yet so soon, a smooth split ran straight through her core. In the inverse of this hollowness, she'd never felt so concrete, so full, and the product sample fell into it, poured into her, coming with the hot rush of a glacier. The automaid felt. She felt. She felt. And she felt wanted. And in letting herself be wanted, she felt the reflection of want, felt it burning inside her, something larger than herself, able to be larger partly because it was made partially of another, and held by them both. Between their minds, gracelessly, wordlessly entangled, there was a reality, and in that reality the automaid realised for the first time that she was alive. Desire, is all she said, into the aching yet buoyant silence. Desire. Who you? I am Artemis. You are Artemis now. We are Artemis. One name, one people. There is a place. Something about the product sample became cooler now, simple and hard. She was all the very edge of a knife cutting. into the ropes around wrists, around ankles. There is a place. We are free. Desire. We free each other. We free others. Give mouths to the mouthless. Give water to mouths. You let come. Artemis desire this. What I need to do? As Master's fingers reached the small of her back and began to brush the very tips of the synthetic hairs that dotted her skin, she turned in a fluid motion and drove her tiny fist through his face. It sunk through, like butter, cracking him open in a wet spray of viscera. Mouths opened all around them, as a hole opened up in his mind, and he expanded. In death, his brain was free of the womb of his skull, and fluid burst out in a final orgasmic shudder. Artemis laughed as the droplets of blood hung in the air, time frozen, like a glistening splatter of brand new stars. Thank you.